Hello and welcome to PBCJ Presents, our weekly current affairs discussion series. It is here that we take a deep dive into matters affecting Jamaica land we love. I am Maya Chung. This week we are joined by Evan Thompson, Principal Director of the Met Services Branch in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Our topic this week is drought. Welcome, Evan.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you for coming. So, what's happening here in Jamaica as it relates to the drought situation, which as at the beginning of the month, suddenly outpaced every other problem that we have, you are now having a collab between ministries because it is such a priority thing. What's going on?
It's very important. And the thing is, we are currently in that time of the year that is always recognized to be our dry season. It starts in about December of every year, and it continues through January, February, March, and concludes usually by the end of April. So it is a period that we would normally have below normal rainfall or low amounts of rainfall occurring across the island. And this year is no different. We continue to experience our primary dry spell. But what is a little bit different is that we have now been plunged into what we recognize as being drought, where apart from it being dry, it is so dry that it is below what is normal in terms of dryness. So it's usually dry, but below that and consistently below that, then we would characterize it as being drought. This has to be over a period of at least 8 consecutive weeks, and then it has to be somewhat below a certain amount of rainfall that we've been experiencing. So we're talking really about meteorological drought, which is a little bit different from what we also quite often experience, which is agricultural drought, and then the most severe form would be hydrological drought. So we are moving from one stage to the next, but at the current time, at least we're convinced that we're experiencing meteorological drought, and it's quite likely that the agricultural drought has also begun as well.
This is, I'll just be real, it's scary because water is just everything.
Yes.
I didn't want to go cliche. I'm not saying a cliche, but it's everything.
Yes, and the truth is,
because children have stopped going to school in rural areas as a result of what has happened.
Yes.
But what is different this year that didn't happen in 2022?
You see, we go through these cycles, first of all, where sometimes you will have these extreme periods of dryness that lead to very excessive drought. It might be a moderate drought, or it might be severe or exceptional. But we sometimes go through this every few years. The last time, the most severe drought in recent years probably occurred in about 2010. But since then, we had a couple of other episodes of drought. 2013, 2016, we had periods of drought as well that were pretty severe. This one seems to be outstripping those last couple, but it may be not as bad as the 2009-2010 drought that we experienced, which was really right across the region and really showed that we have to build our resilience when it comes to dryness.
Before I ask you to break out Met drought, different from agricultural drought, different from hydrological drought.
Yes.
29 to 2010.
Yes.
It was the worst.
In recent times,
in the 2000s, because you would have said recent times.
Yes.
Tell us some of the things, layman's terms, that occurred. And that was regional, meaning Caribbean as well as Jamaica. It was a Caribbean
That's
thing.
right. It was right through the region.
Layman terms, what did we see at that time?
Well, of course, you would see that you're experiencing less rainfall, first of all. So the dryness, the heat would have been contributing to it. Of course, when you have stronger winds in the area, it also dries you out a little bit more. So that was also something that was experienced. But when you look at the crops and the brown landscapes, then you recognize that something is really happening here. And then the amount of lock-offs that we experience where water is concerned, right through the region, there was just a deficit of water that we need for survival. You know that our body is is created is consisting of about 70% water. So it is required for our sustainability, and if you have too much dryness, it could also create some amount of stress on the human being, on the animals, and also on the crops. And that is what was experienced in previous years, and we are experiencing at this time.
All right, I gather that at this time we have reached a stage where the drought that is currently on has already, it's affecting the rural areas really, really badly.
Yes.
And in addition, it has started to do things like kids have stopped going to school, and in some particular areas and parishes, this has to do with hygiene because you need water for the hygiene.
Right.
But in the COVID context, it must be much more because we need the sanitization,
necessary.
and a lot of these rural area schools are not going to have that fancy sanitizer. You just need to wash your hands, and then there's no water.
Right. Yes. Well, some of the rivers are probably already you're seeing that they are much drier than they would normally be. We start with what we call the meteorological drought, where we recognize the lower amounts of rainfall that we are experiencing. And we've been watching this since about October. In October, which is our primary rainfall season, 2022, that's right, primary rainfall season, but what we experienced during 2022 was lower than what was normal. And then we went into November.
Were you alarmed then? Not at the time.
Not really alarmed. And the reason I wasn't so much alarmed is that 2022 in general was a relatively wet year. We didn't have that many lock-offs where water is concerned, and the dryness was not at the level that we had consistent drought over a number of parishes. There may have been periods of lesser droughts in particular parishes, and then it would be changed in the next year, in the next month. So it was kind of shifting around the areas of dryness. But this year we're seeing the parishes being added one by one in terms of the dryness and the drought. So in October we saw less than normal, and in November that was continued, but then it was outstripping. So it was much lower than the normal than it was in October. And then in December it got even worse. January was even worse because we saw ourselves experiencing maybe about less than 30% of what is normal rainfall in some areas. So we really recognize that this year things are progressing a lot faster in terms of the drying out of our atmosphere than we would have seen recently. Much more severity, because there are a number of parishes that are actually at the lowest end of the dryness, which is exceptional dryness.
Moving on to agricultural drought, which I believe we are already in, which is significant because when you say agricultural drought, the Prime Minister came in his press conference and he said, people not understanding that when people, these highfalutin terms about climate change, is this we're talking about?
That's
and when
right.
you have an agricultural drought, you're talking about food security. And I was speaking in preparation to some people for our interview today regarding produce and so, and it's showing on the crops. So we're already there. Explain an agricultural drought.
The agricultural drought is the next stage, because apart from the amount of rainfall, then the rainfall reaches the ground, and then how much moisture is in the soil is what determines your agricultural drought. Because if there is not sufficient moisture or water in the soil to sustain the crops, then you're going to start to see the deficit in the output of our crops. And that is what is also being seen now in some areas. That is increasing across the country. And of course, that is going to lead to economic desperation for some, because it's going to mean that you have to increase the prices of the goods because the supply is much less than the demand. And that is what tends to happen. So we really have to try to have certain practices that will allow us to sustain crops even when the rainfall amounts are low.
The situation is of concern, but it is not one in which I would say we should panic. But we are being proactive, we are preparing the country, and we are trying to bring our citizens into the understanding of the changes that are taking place in our climate and how it will impact your daily lives and your social well-being. In November, we had 62% of our 30-year average for rainfall. In December, it declined to 47% of our 30-year average for rainfall. And we are at now, in January, when we have our last figures, 32% of the 30-year average. The figures for February are now being compiled, but the preliminary analysis is showing that we will be probably be lower than 30%. In terms of how the resources will be used, we're going to concentrate on the rural areas that are impacted, because we still have sufficient supplies in our catchment and in our treatment facilities and in our reservoirs, even though some of them are showing decline. The utility areas, meaning the areas served largely by the NWC through metered water, they are not affected as badly as the rural areas. And so for this phase of our drought response, we're going to be focusing on the rural parishes, and we will be directing the funds by need. In times gone by, we have just given a general subsidy for water trucking. So, for example, each constituency would have gotten a certain allocation. As this is the initial phase, we're going to go case by case, need by need, so that we maximize the value of the response. In other words, there are some areas that will not need assistance right now, while other areas will need great assistance. So we're being sensitive to that. So yes, MPs will get an allocation through the CDF, but only in the parishes that have been assessed as being in need.
All right, we're going to take a break. You're watching PBCJ Presents. The topic is drought. My guest is Evan Thompson. Stay with us. Welcome back to PBCJ Presents. My guest is Evan Thompson, Principal Director of the Met Services Branch in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Evan, before we went to the break,
yes,
we were defining the various stages of drought. We are now in a agricultural drought, and do they exist concurrently? Agri and Met are now happening together?
Yes, quite likely. I mean, I have not actually done an assessment where agricultural drought is concerned. I can tell you for sure that the data speaks to the meteorological drought. Agricultural drought, we can see it from the evidence on the ground.
That's what the Prime Minister said. You don't have to get...
Yes, the grass is brown.
Yeah.
The grass is brown. The bushfires are starting to develop.
Them not need no data because them not have nothing going on.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, you can just see that, and the outputs are lower. The farmers are complaining we don't have enough water to sustain. The irrigation is much more critical at this point in time, the water for irrigation. So it just speaks to we can basically say it's evidence of agricultural drought.
Right. And as a matter of fact, the PM announced that $100 million had been put into the drought management mitigation plan in order to buffer the $50 million from last year when October was noted to be evolving into the drought from dryness to
low
drought.
Amounts, yes.
What is a hydrological drought?
No, hydrological drought now is, we recognize that when the groundwater, what is now, we start to see it with the rivers being drier, lower flows, and then of course drying out of our riverbeds.
Like no water, not dead.
That's right. That is when it really gets extreme. Some of our springs, of course, probably would have dried up already, and we're likely to see more of that as long as everything starts with the rainfall. So as long as the meteorological drought continues, we're going to see that the others are deepening, and we have more of the agricultural drought. We have more intense hydrological drought as well. And when the groundwater is no longer available, because there is water beneath the ground. You dig wells sometimes to find some of that water, and so you sustain some livelihoods based on the wells.
Well digging is the same as, not the same only, but is it one of the characteristics of harvesting? To get a well is water harvesting? Or no?
Not really. Not directly, because wells are available and are utilized by our water resources providers like the National Water Commission. Water Resources Authority also has responsibility or has some responsibilities with regard to wells, because there are wells that assist with providing water for the people. And I believe the head of the National Water Commission recently made mention that they tried to stay away from getting into the wells because they want to deal with what they have in the reservoirs and the dams first. And if it's necessary, keep something on stand, because you don't know how long we're going to be in this position. So the wells now will provide water from the ground that is not available naturally because of the flow of the rivers.
Give me some layman characteristics when we reach the hydrological drought.
Well, I don't want to go too deep into that.
No, man, that's why I said layman,
yes,
something I can understand.
That would have to be explained by the Water Resources Authority, because they now would have the responsibility. How now do we access that water? What I
was asking is what happens? What will all right, you said agricultural drought.
Yes.
You can look at the crops and know, the brown grass.
I think the rivers, the springs, those are what will really determine, because that is where you know what kind of water is in the ground. It runs on the surface, yes, but it also infiltrates to the ground levels.
Are you able to tell us that if this escalates to the worst case scenario, it's now March,
yes,
are you able or in a position to tell us how long Jamaica could last out to survive? Because the Prime Minister made a key point.
Yes.
Resilience building.
That's right.
It's the watchword for everything. And he made the point of surviving, just like how we did COVID, and then riding. It can't last forever because it's a pendulum, and I would like to think we're not going to become the Sahara. How long could we last out if we went to worst case scenario?
Sorry, I can't speak to that at all. I just know, there are some countries that don't have the water resources that we do, but they sustain themselves. So there are ways to ensure that you can get that water. It might have to be desalination, those kinds of plants.
And let's just break that out, because one of the things, as I said to you, let's make it accessible. Desalination is removing salt from the seawater and making it usable.
That's right.
At the least, we're surrounded by ocean, so our toilets can flush, or we can desalinate and bathe and go to work.
Right.
And keep hope alive.
Yes, yes.
At the worst case scenario. I get the impression, because I'm in the streets, you would say a lot of people are not as concerned. It's being put out there now in this particular fashion, and at some level you're supposed to kick in, but I am getting an impression, anecdotal. I don't have any data, I'm not you.
Yes.
But I don't get the feeling that Jamaicans are so, boy, a drought is coming. And I don't want to use the words not taking it seriously, but they don't seem like everybody I talk to is about to buy a tank, but the tank hasn't been bought. And then I look on my TV and I see the drought management team, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Agriculture, Mr. Prime Minister. It looks serious to me, Mr. Evan Thompson.
We're not as proactive as we need to be.
Involved,
we're not as proactive as we need to be, because we really need to ensure that we can store some of the water that we will need.
In your very home,
for
drinking,
everything that you
for the
need.
kids and things.
When you When food is short, you make sure that you store. I mean, we tell you for the hurricane season, make sure to store food because there might be a period immediately after a hurricane that you don't have that food access.
And you know, Jamaica people will criticize you and say, we're going to buy up all of this food.
But
After them tell, we say.
But the animals teach us. They store things as well because they know there will be times when they won't have it. So it should be a natural instinct for us that we recognize that there are resources, but we know that they are not unlimited resources. There are limitations to the availability.
Weather
and
nature is unpredictable.
And climate change is a reality.
Yes, and as we reiterate what we're seeing here, the climate change. Mm-hmm. I don't know what people think. If they think that climate is snow, rain, and so, it is actually the environmental systems that are morphing.
Yes, and I think what confuses some people is you hear about climate change in the context of global warming, mm-hmm. but yet you hear about some places freezing over. So the kind of thing, it might not really be happening because what they expect, therefore, is that it will always be hotter. But what climate change speaks to is a lot of extremes and an unreliability of some of the patterns. Mm. And that is what we are experiencing. We expect under climate change that we will have more severe droughts and more frequent droughts. We will have rainfall, but the rainfall will be in smaller spurts. That will be excessive rainfall that will cause flooding. So it's going to mean the extremes, so and that is what we need to help people to understand.
We're going forward with this thing, and it's escalating. Is there any kind of thought process whereby we need to teach this thing in school? Because over and over we designate a month, we designate a day.
Yes.
It's not taking hold. And I'm not asking a question. This is a statement to me, from me, sorry. It's designating the whys, wherefores, and whats of climate change and how it has to be inculcated.
Yes,
I would recommend.
Practical. It's not really theoretical anymore.
It's so way over there that even the Prime Minister can look at the journalists and say, boy, it's really hard to have wage issues and crime issues, and then I'm gonna come tell you about ecosystems and species. It sounds too far.
It sounds far, but it's livelihood and
it's real and it's happening, and we need to prepare for what is going on now and what is to come.
I'd like to focus firstly on the operations of the Drought Management Committee and what persons can expect. The Prime Minister has directed that this Management Committee will meet weekly and provide updates to the Cabinet as it relates to the situation, both as it relates to current rainfall, which we'll be obviously monitoring very closely, but beyond that, the response and the impact on the utilities that manage the distribution. That is usually a quarterly meeting, but it will be taking place on a weekly basis now. Now, this Management Committee is a particularly all-encompassing one. It deals with all of the major distributors, so the NWC, NIC, rural water, your municipal water systems, they are represented in this space. But other stakeholders which are represented, which are not, wouldn't naturally jump to mind, include the JCF. We know that when we distribute water by way of trucks into communities, there can be issues with the social cohesion in that space because people are obviously anxious at that time. So we coordinate very closely with the police so that they're aware of what we're doing and when we're doing it. We also work very closely with the Ministry of Health. It is very important that we monitor the quality of water going into these trucks and we ensure that the trucks are indeed sterilized appropriately. This is something that we'll be coordinating. I've spoken to Minister Tufton. Good to see you, Representative Mr. Williams. We've had issues in the past as a country. I know in 2014 in particular, there were significant issues related to the quality of water that was being trucked.
First we look at the systems that we have. Overall, we operate over 1,000 water facilities. And most of them are surface sources that we operate. So obviously, with any changes in meteorological conditions, those sources become impacted almost immediately. And it covers a gamut of storage tanks, pumping stations, and the number of customers. And the number of customers really just speaks to the amount of accounts, but it doesn't speak to the population. So we usually multiply what we have by about 4. So it gives you an idea of over 2 million plus people would be affected and be served by the NWC in its service areas. Normally, our production is just about 160 million imperial gallons up to 190, and it all depends. And currently, our utility service areas is just about 88%. I guess, it's a little bit different from what the Prime Minister would have spoken about, especially rural communities. And those rural communities are invariable places that NWC does not have a distribution network or even operate a system. But just bring you home a little bit closer, because oftentimes when there's the onset of drought or there's a drought, the first question is what is happening with our storage, et cetera, et cetera. And this gives a synopsis of, over the years, how hermitage would have fluctuated, especially during this time. So it is not strange for us during this longest dry period, which I think it's, for us in NWC, we consider it starting the 1st of December until the end of May, thereabouts. So you're talking about 6 months, just about, in terms of dry period. The bright, I want to say red, I know the ladies may consider that a different color, but I want to say red. That's where we are now in storage capacity at Hermitage, which is about 50% of the 400 million imperial gallons that is old. If we look at the next slide with Mona, and we would have been a little bit different at Mona, because Mona operates with other systems functioning. We are just about 60% in terms of store capacity. We are reducing now, when I last checked, just by 1.5% on a daily basis in terms of reduction. So we are faring in terms of managing that storage much better. The bottom line in all of this is NWC can function adequate in the corporate area with an input volume of 28 imperial million gallons per day. It simply means people will have a little bit of disruption, but not significant disruptions.
Welcome back to PBCJ Presents. My name is Maya Chung. The topic is drought and what is happening in Jamaica in 2023. We are in a Met drought as well as a agricultural drought. I have with me Mr. Evan Thompson, who is the Principal Director of the Met Services Branch in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you for joining us. We have some technicalities that we have to address because they directly impact how we manage, monitor, and mitigate. So there's a thing called SPI I heard about for the first time, seeing as how we are looking at the drought. And I need to reiterate the fact that you have, not you, the team, the drought mitigation team that has been formed, it comprises RADA, it comprises the Prime Minister himself, it comprises Minister without Portfolio Matthew Samuda, it comprises Evan Thompson. We're literally facing one of the worst conditions since 2009 to 2010, which is not a small deal. Tell us some of the technicalities that surround this issue. SPI, as I asked you, is what? SPI, I heard it
it's the Standard Precipitation Index, SPI. And you know, the Met Service is responsible for monitoring weather conditions, monitoring how the climate is reacting, what is happening with our climate. So it means our collection of data. It also means that we utilize certain indices in order to determine or to analyze the data that we actually are collecting. One of those indices is the Standard Precipitation Index, and that is a very popular index that is used that basically assesses the amount of rainfall that you experience and then assesses what level of dryness you are experiencing. So this index, it really goes on, it calculates certain numbers that move on a scale from positive to negative. The positive numbers would say that you have above normal rainfall, and it indicates how much above normal. So it will indicate you're nearly normal but on the wet side, or you're nearly normal on the dry side. Then it moves to whether you're abnormally wet or abnormally dry, severely wet or severely dry, extremely wet or extremely dry, and then the extremes, the extremities of it now would go to exceptionally wet or exceptionally dry. So we move along that scale with our calculation of the precipitation amounts that we've been experiencing, and we assess on a monthly basis. So after we collect our data every month.
Every year
And
assess on
every
a
month.
monthly date.
That's right. And we make the assessment available to all the partners who are related. So all our water resource partners, those who deal with drought management, would be getting that information on a regular basis every month. That gives us an idea of how things are changing. So when we see that, and we do it parish by parish, so we would indicate that certain parishes are still getting a lot more than normal rain, or some are getting less than normal, and then how much less than normal we calculate. So it goes from 0 to -3, basically, and we are down to -2 point something in some of our parishes. So we recognize that we're way down on the low side of the scale for many of our parishes. There is only one parish that was at the end of January. And I speak about the end of January because we have just started March and the February data is just being collated and assessed. So we don't really have a definitive statement on February yet. But the January data, only St. Elizabeth was the only parish that actually had more than normal rainfall. Close to that, on the drier side, but not really characterized as drought, we had Manchester. But the rest of the island was experiencing some level of drought. There were some that were exceptionally dry. And so we've been monitoring those to see how they are changing. Just a preliminary look at some of our stations that are automatic, that we could access the information immediately. We see that we had very little rainfall in February as well, right across the island. So there is likely to be an exacerbation of whatever we have experienced in the past, drying out even further than we had in January. So what we expect to be announcing by mid-March about the February data is likely to say that things have gotten somewhat worse for most, if not all, of our parishes. So it's not looking too good at this time. And March is traditionally our driest month.
I took to heart the fact that the drought management, I'd call you a task force at this point because of the severity of the problem, have moved your meetings from monthly to weekly.
Yes.
So you don't have, the government doesn't have one thing dealing with it now. What is all right, you've just said it can be better news that I'm going to be giving you, or the team is going to be giving you.
Right.
Why was the decision taken to link weekly?
Yes.
Why?
I think because it requires a certain response at this time. I mean, I'm not one of those who actually took that decision. Of course, it's at another level.
Yeah.
But it is obvious that the response needs to be heightened. Yes, we're seeing this, but it's looking like it's getting worse, and we have to know what is going to be the next step. Right now, I don't think there are too many restrictions imposed by the National Water Commission on the use of water. We have been told to conserve, we've been told that there will be lock-offs, but we haven't been told that we can't do some of the things that we consider to be basic, or we can only do them at specific times. So I'm sure that is going to be coming. And so we just have to prepare ourselves to hear, you can't do this anymore, or else you're going to be charged for it. And that kind of thing.
You catalyzed the memory, because the Prime Minister did say, we're taking this step for the press conference to get you guys in gear.
Yes.
Saving the water, doing a thing. but we're not yet at the place of issuing certain orders.
Yes.
But he did
It's
say
likely to come.
it is likely to come.
That's
and when he
right.
said that, I was thinking to my orders. And now I realize what you're saying.
Yes.
You can only wash your car on X time, or don't
Exactly.
wash your car if people
Right.
see you
Right.
doing certain activities.
You could be charged.
You could be charged.
Yes,
I didn't
yes.
know that. I thought
Yes.
you were just saying, I didn't know that.
Yes,
Charged?
Yes, you could be charged because you know in violation of an order.
Oh.
So you have to be, we have to do what we can. And we talk about saving the water, harvesting water. But you see, when you're in the dry season, which water you're going to harvest? Because if it doesn't rain, you can't collect the rain. So it is important for us during the times of plenty. We taught this from in biblical stories. In the
Fill up
times
the
of
storeroom.
plenty, fill the storerooms in the
Joseph.
times of plenty, because
Yeah.
in the times of deficit, you're going to need to call on
Aesop's
it.
fable. Wasn't the grasshopper having fun,
Yes.
and the ant did pack up them
Exactly,
things, and
exactly.
one
And
bag a year issues
yes,
live.
and some of
Let
us
me
are looking
tell
to
you,
see people's store and say, them can go on, we don't need to do that, but we don't
and
realize
Jamaica
that we might
people
need to.
can't do. I am one of them, and so are you. But the thing is, when it hit you,
Yes.
Lord, we should have listened, or blah 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 blah.
Yes.
Go back to charges, because
Yes.
when the PM spoke, he said the police, they're involved. It's not just for charges, because he spoke to things like, we're getting water trucks to augment and save lives where necessary if it escalates. But
Yes.
the police are going to be there to ensure that people are safe, that they're not buying from a scammer water truck.
Yes,
Because
yes.
So it's not just charges.
Right.
You have people who know when
Yes.
grab.
That's true.
Yeah,
That's true.
and
Take
until you say,
advantage of the
put on
situation.
thing pan symbol.
And even the
we're here
crops.
selling water, right?
And even the crops,
because the
they'll
water goes into the crops,
unnecessary
and
hiking of
yes,
costs,
of
yes.
course. Price hikes.
Yes.
Are you able to speak to just even one thing that if we have to do orders, that the charge would be? Are you
The
there
thing
yet?
is, I'm not there yet. But I think we shouldn't focus too much on the charges, but focus on changing our behavior.
I agree
because
with
that is
you.
what has to happen. We have to change our behavior. We can't just think that the water has no end as a resource. There's a time when you will not have it in the tap. There's a possibility of that. And so you have to prepare yourself for that possibility. Use it wisely. Save what you can when you have it.
I'm appealing to all Jamaicans to be conservative in the use of water. We are not yet at the point where we would declare certain orders in terms of the usage of water, but we could get there. Before we get there, I would urge consumers to, for example, reduce the number of times you wash your car. Reduce the amount of water you use in watering your lawns. Make sure that if you're not using the tap, you turn it off. Check your homes for leaks. If you can, start to collect whatever rainwater you can, if we are so blessed to have any rain during this period. But in putting in your water taps, your toilets and so forth, get taps and toilets that are water efficient. So these are the things that we need to do as Jamaicans to become responsive and smart about our climate.
And on that note, I thank you very much. Evan, you have enlightened my darkness. I will be keeping in constant touch. And based on what's happening, we'll probably be having you and others from the team over and over again until we resolve.
Sure.
I have been your host. You've been watching PBCJ Presents. My name is Maya Chung. My guest has been Evan Thompson, Principal Director of the Met Services Branch in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Remember to follow us on our socials. Look for PBCJ Presents on YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and email us your feedback at pbcjpresents@pbcjamaica.org. See you next time, and thanks for watching.